My in-laws threw me a baby shower, but when I walked in, they served me divorce papers instead, and then When I first moved to Riverbend, I didn't expect to stay more than a year. It was supposed to be a brief stop between graduating from art school in Chicago and figuring out what to do with the rest of my life. But one summer afternoon, in a sun-drenched park during a community art fair, I met Grant. He wasn't like the men I had dated before. There was something precise and practiced in the way he moved, as if he had been born in a world with rules I didn't know existed. Grant was tall, confident, and spoke like every word he said had already been tested and approved by someone powerful. He told me he worked for his family's development company, Dunn Properties, and that they were building luxury homes by the lake. I didn't care much for real estate, but I cared about how he made me feel, like I was the only person in the park worth paying attention to. We started seeing each other that week. I should have noticed how quickly things moved, how deliberately he folded me into his life without ever really entering mine. I introduced him to my friends. He introduced me to his world. And by world, I mean his family. They owned most of Riverbend, or at least that's how it seemed. The library bore their name. So did the hospital, a park, a scholarship fund, and 2 entire streets. People in town didn't just respect the Dunns. They feared them, adored them, and silently obeyed them. I was 29 then, still idealistic, still believing that love could overcome anything if you worked hard enough. Grant proposed after 8 months, standing in front of the lake during a perfectly choreographed dinner date that I later realized his mother had arranged down to the napkin color. I said yes, of course. Who wouldn't? He was attentive, generous, and always talking about a future we'd build together. His exact words were, "My family might be a little traditional, but they'll come to love you." Spoiler, they didn't. I met his parents, Charles and Margot, 2 weeks after the engagement. Their house wasn't a house. It was a historical landmark turned fortress, 3 stories of stained glass and mahogany and velvet-covered silence. Margot greeted me like she was hosting a rival dignitary. She smiled with her mouth and stared with eyes so sharp I thought she might slice me open right there in the marble-floored foyer. That first dinner, Charles looked me up and down before asking, "You teach art? Is that sustainable?" I smiled, politely answering that I taught kids at a local studio and freelanced on weekends. Margot sipped her wine and said nothing for a long time before murmuring, "Creative. How charming." Her tone suggested I had just announced I worked in a traveling circus. I spent that night curled in Grant's arms, whispering my doubts. He kissed my hair and promised everything would get easier once they got to know me. I believed him. God, I wanted to believe him. After we got married the following spring, Margot handed me a handwritten schedule of every charitable event, fundraiser, and tea circle I was expected to attend. No one asked if I was comfortable giving up weekends, or how I'd juggle work and those endless events. I started dropping my art classes, one by one, until the studio finally called and said they'd hired someone else. Our home wasn't really ours either. We moved into one of the Dunn family's historic townhomes downtown, just 3 blocks from Margot's estate. She had a key, of course. Charles had the alarm codes. Simone, Grant's sister-in-law, popped by uninvited, usually with her 2 sons, always with backhanded comments about my empty living room shelves and lack of heirloom china. There was one day, about 3 months in, when I left a pan unwashed in the sink overnight. The next morning, I came home from errands to find it gone and replaced with a note in Margot's tidy cursive. "A lady keeps her kitchen as she does her reputation, clean and impeccable." I laughed at the time, thinking it was a weird family quirk. But that was only the beginning. They never shouted. They never cursed. Their cruelty came in the form of silence, disapproving glances, and expectations hung around your neck like chains. Grant changed, too, slowly at first, then all at once. He started staying late at the office. When I asked about dinner plans, he answered in half sentences. When I talked about painting again, he shrugged like I'd just asked to take up finger painting. The baby conversation started right after our 6-month anniversary. Charles brought it up first, with Margot watching like a hawk. "You're the oldest son," he said, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. "You have a legacy to continue." Simone leaned in, beaming. My boys were both born before our first anniversary. You don't want to fall behind. Margot nodded. In the Dunn family, we build from the roots. It's tradition. I wasn't ready, but no one asked if I was. A month later, the fertility appointment started. Grant never missed one, not because he wanted to support me, but because his mother demanded weekly updates. When I started hormone injections, Margot sent over pamphlets for gender-boosting diets. I kept thinking, maybe after the baby, things would settle. Maybe they'd soften. Maybe Grant would come back to me. In the second year, I started documenting everything in a notebook I hid in the guest bedroom's closet behind a loose floorboard. It wasn't for revenge, not at first. It was just to keep myself sane, to remind myself that the small humiliations, the slights, the gaslighting, they were real. When I finally got pregnant, I cried. I cried harder than I'd ever cried in my life. Grant's reaction was a flat, "I'll let my father know." That was it. That was all he said. Charles smiled for the first time since the wedding. Margot called it a blessed inevitability. I was 8 weeks in and already a footnote in my own life. And then came the ultrasound. It was a girl. I remember the silence in the car ride home like it was tattooed in my bones. Grant kept his hands on the wheel, eyes forward, mouth set in a grim line. "We'll try again next time," he finally muttered. Next time. That night, I ate dinner in silence while the entire Dunn clan pretended they hadn't just condemned my unborn daughter with their disappointment. I looked down at my stomach and thought, "You are not a failure. You are mine, and I will protect you." 2 months later, Margot called with what she called a generous gesture. She had planned a baby shower. She said it would be elegant, private, and a celebration of new beginnings. I wanted to believe she meant it. I really did. That was my mistake. The invitation arrived on pale cream paper, with rose gold lettering and an embossed seal at the bottom that read, "The Dunn family cordially invites you to a celebration in honor of Claire." That was it. No mention of baby shower. No reference to the baby at all, just my name and a date, neatly printed with robotic elegance. Still, I wanted to believe. I wanted to think, even after everything, that maybe they had finally seen me. Maybe this was Margot's awkward, overly formal way of extending an olive branch. Foolish, right? Grant left that morning before sunrise. I heard him close the front door with the same detached quiet he always used lately, as if being loud might disturb the delicate lie he was living. He said he had to be at the venue early to help the staff with setup. I asked if he wanted me to bring anything, and he said no without even making eye contact. Then he was gone, and I sat alone on the edge of our bed with my hands resting on my 8-month belly, telling myself that whatever happened today, I could get through it for her. Always for her. I wore the soft blue dress Margot had sent over weeks ago, even though it barely fit anymore. I curled my hair, pinned it back like she always insisted looked refined, and took a cab to the Riverbend Yacht Club, an overly lavish space the Dunns used for every private function that couldn't be held in their own estate. The driver asked if it was my first child. I told him yes, and when he said, "Congratulations, you must be so excited," I nodded and gave a smile that didn't reach my eyes. There were 3 staff members waiting when we pulled up to the front steps, all in pressed black suits, standing in a line like they were welcoming royalty or attending a funeral. One stepped forward and opened my door. "Miss Claire, we've been expecting you. Please follow me." His voice was neutral, but something in his eyes made me uneasy. I chalked it up to nerves. We walked past the main ballroom, which was unusually quiet. No soft music, no laughter, no pastel balloons or streamers in sight. Instead, we turned down a long hallway to a secondary reception room, one normally reserved for press briefings or board meetings. I thought maybe there had been a last-minute change of plans. Maybe the original room had an issue. Maybe. The moment the double doors opened, every molecule in my body stopped moving. There was no baby shower, no decorations, no gifts or tables with tiny cupcakes or pink ribbons. Instead, there was a banner stretched across the ceiling beams in bold, aggressive lettering. "Farewell Party." It was blood red, loud and deliberate, hanging over a room full of stiff, silent faces. The entire Dunn family was there. Charles, Margot, Simone, Miles, Grant. And beside Grant stood a woman I had never seen before in my life, wearing a crimson dress and a satisfied smirk, her hand resting lightly on my husband's shoulder like she owned him. There were documents on a table in the center, neatly stacked, clipped, and arranged beside two suitcases. My suitcases. I didn't move. I couldn't move. My legs were rooted to the floor, and I felt the blood drain from my face as I stared at the woman beside my husband. She wasn't even pretending to be subtle. She was younger than me, maybe mid-20s, tan and surgically symmetrical, and she looked like she couldn't wait for whatever was about to happen next. Margot was the first to speak. "Well," she said, her voice smooth as ice, "you're late." I blinked. What is this?" Charles walked over to the table and tapped the folder of papers with 2 fingers. "Divorce. Our lawyers have handled everything. All that's left is your signature." I turned to Grant, begging him with my eyes to say something, to tell me this was a mistake or a sick joke, but his face was unreadable. "Claire," he said, "this is Melissa. She and I have decided to start a life together." I couldn't process what I was hearing. I looked at Melissa, who gave me a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's so nice to finally meet you," she said, as if we were being introduced at a tea party and not at my own public execution. "You're 8 months pregnant," I whispered, barely able to speak. "And your job is done," Grant said without flinching. "We have an heir." That was the purpose. The purpose. My voice cracked. Margot stepped forward with that awful, syrupy smile she always wore when twisting the knife. "You were never one of us, dear. But you gave us what we needed. You should feel proud." Simone leaned toward her husband and whispered something that made them both snicker. Then Margot added, "We will raise the child properly. You may go now. Your things are packed. You'll be compensated, of course." And in that moment, with my body aching and my baby kicking gently inside me, something snapped inside of me. The humiliation burned hot for exactly 5 seconds, then turned into something sharper, something cold and focused, something final. I reached slowly into my purse, ignoring the shifting silence in the room, and pulled out my phone. "You think this is the end?" I said, voice steady, louder than I expected. "You really think you get to throw me away and walk out clean?" Grant raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" I pressed a button on my phone. Behind me, the massive screen that hung across the front of the reception room lit up with a video. At first, there was silence, then soft audio. A bed came into view. Our bed. Grant's voice murmuring something low and filthy to Melissa as they laughed and kissed in the home I had kept clean while he lied to me every day. A murmur swept through the crowd. The woman from the mayor's office stepped back, clearly uncomfortable. A reporter I didn't recognize scribbled something in a notebook. Melissa's face lost all color. Grant tried to step toward me, but I moved aside before he could grab my arm. "This is just the beginning," I said. I pressed another button. A new video appeared. Charles was seated in a private office, talking to someone about a land swap deal. "Change the numbers. It'll pass audit if we bury it in Q3, he said. "We've done it before. Just don't leave a trail." People in the crowd started whispering. I saw a city council member step back toward the exit. Someone else began filming with their phone. Margot hissed, "You sneaky little." I turned to her with a smile that didn't feel like mine. I recorded everything. Every word. Every insult. Every illegal deal. Charles looked like he was about to explode. "This is defamation. You won't get away with this." But I was already walking toward the door. As it opened, my lawyer stepped in, followed by a local reporter and 2 plainclothes officers from the city's financial crimes unit. And that was how the real farewell party began. The moment my lawyer, Mara, stepped into the room, you could feel the atmosphere shift like a thunderstorm had rolled in. She wasn't dressed like someone you could intimidate. Black suit, heels that echoed across the marble floor, and a leather folder thick with years of work in her hand. The woman beside her, slightly older with silver-streaked hair and fire in her eyes, was a representative from the Financial Accountability Task Force, and judging by the badge pinned to her jacket, she meant business. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Behind me, the giant screen was still glowing with the paused frame of Charles mid-sentence, his mouth slightly open, hand gesturing in a way that made him look arrogant and cornered all at once. A second later, Mara turned and nodded toward the double doors behind the crowd. That's when a line of women walked in. They weren't anyone you'd recognize in this town, at least not by name. But they were the ones Charles and his company had taken advantage of for years. Single mothers who were promised affordable housing, only to be priced out mid-build. Elderly women forced out of their lifelong homes after forged rezoning documents appeared out of nowhere. Teachers, nurses, a woman who used to run the town's flower shop until her lease was reevaluated. All of them had stories. And today, they had each other. The guests, what few hadn't already slipped quietly out the side doors, turned in their seats and started whispering louder now. No one looked comfortable, and no one, not even Margot, could say a damn thing. I stepped forward, placed my phone face up on the table, and showed them the screen. We're live streaming, by the way. It's been up since the moment I walked in. 463 people are watching right now. And climbing. Grant swore under his breath and lunged for the phone like I hadn't just spent 3 years preparing for this. I stepped back without blinking, and Mara casually moved between us, her body language calm but resolute. "Try anything," she said coolly, "and we file the assault charges along with everything else." The man from the county sheriff's department finally entered, stepping around Charles with a polite but firm tone. "Mr. Dunn, we'd like to ask you to come with us voluntarily to discuss allegations related to real estate fraud and financial misconduct. We can do this here, or you can accompany us to the station." Charles didn't respond. He just sat there, jaw tight, eyes darting between me, the crowd, and the slowly growing cluster of press waiting at the back of the room. Margot tried to save face. She stood up, raised her chin like a queen commanding her court, and said, "This is nothing but a theatrical display put on by a bitter woman desperate for attention." I didn't even look at her. I simply pressed another button. The screen changed again. This time, it showed a hallway camera feed from inside the Dunn estate. Her voice echoed over the speakers, sharp, acidic, unmistakable. "She's nothing. Trash we polished up for optics. Get the child, then get her out." Someone gasped in the back. Someone else whispered, "My God." The reporter from the Riverbend Times stepped forward and asked the question I knew was coming. "Claire, how long have you been collecting this?" I turned toward her, steady and measured. "Since the first night I was told I wasn't good enough to eat at the same table as his sister. Since the first time Margot told me I was lucky to be allowed into this family. Since the moment I realized Grant would never stand up for me." Then I turned to look at him. "And since the day your fertility doctor handed me your results, and I realized you were the problem all along." Grant turned red so fast I thought he might pass out. He opened his mouth, but I didn't let him speak. "The only reason I was able to carry this child," I said, placing my hand protectively over my belly, "was because I went to a donor. Legally, safely, quietly. While you spent months humiliating me, blaming me, telling your mother I was defective, I was making sure this child would exist. So congratulations, she isn't yours." The silence after that was heavy, stunned, and laced with the sound of every person in that room reevaluating everything they thought they knew. Melissa, who had stayed remarkably quiet up to that point, finally hissed, "You lying bitch." I looked at her the way you look at gum stuck to the bottom of your shoe. That's rich coming from the woman who moved into my bed while I was still bleeding from an injection site. She lunged toward me. Mara stepped forward. 2 of the officers moved in. Melissa froze. At that point, I picked up the divorce papers and flipped through them like they were some casual brochure. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a second folder, twice as thick, and laid it on the table in front of Margot. "These are my terms," I said. "They include financial restitution, full custody, control over my child's education and upbringing, and a formal investigation into every illegal action taken by this family's business over the past decade. You sign now, or we go public with everything." Margot's face was the color of wet ash. Grant didn't say a word. He just stood there, the full weight of his own cowardice pressing down on his shoulders like cement. Mara pushed the pen forward. "We already have a judge who's agreed to review it by morning. You can fight it, but I promise you'll lose." Charles was the first to crack. He stood up and started yelling, some incoherent storm of threats and blame and fury that no longer held any power. The officers moved in, placed a hand on his shoulder, and began walking him toward the exit. The reporter followed closely behind. I stayed where I was, breathing slowly, watching the empire collapse from the inside. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel powerful. What I felt, more than anything, was free. For the first time since I said yes to that ridiculous lakeside proposal, I was no longer trapped in their cage. No more manipulation. No more gaslighting. No more standing quietly while they turned my life into a sacrifice for their reputation. Margot finally picked up the pen and signed. Her hands shook the whole time. As she slid the folder back across the table, she stared up at me with something halfway between hatred and disbelief. "You were nothing when you got here," she said. "Don't forget that." I leaned down, close enough for only her to hear. "Then you should be terrified of what I'll become now that I'm finally something." And I walked out, past the ruins of their legacy, past the shocked stares and stunned silence, past the reporters and the whispers and the blinking cameras. I walked out into the crisp fall air, where my best friend Layla was waiting at the curb with the car door already open. "Holy shit," she said as I slid in beside her. "You actually did it." I looked down at my belly, felt my daughter shift, and said, "This was only the beginning." The morning after the Dunn's empire began to fall, I woke up in my own bed, not in the townhouse Grant and I had shared, not in one of Margot's polished, monitored guest rooms, but in my modest, two-bedroom apartment above the old bakery on Alder Street. It smelled like sourdough and cheap coffee from the cafe downstairs, and it was perfect. Layla had helped me move what little I wanted to keep from the Dunn townhouse during the chaos that followed the farewell party. She hadn't said much while we packed, just stayed close, quiet and watchful, like she knew I was still holding 1,000 volts of adrenaline inside my skin and couldn't take another conversation about what had just happened. For the first time in years, no one was waiting to judge what I wore, question where I went, or tell me that my paintings weren't practical. No one cared that I hadn't brushed my hair or that I ate leftover pasta straight out of the container while my stomach pressed against the edge of the kitchen counter like a soft warning. I had 39 weeks of pregnancy behind me and 1 week to go. Everything in my body ached, but I had never felt lighter. 3 weeks later, I gave birth to my daughter. I named her Nora. No family name. No connection to anyone who had tried to erase me. Just Nora. She arrived in the middle of the night at Riverbend General, where half the nurses had heard about the Dunn scandal and treated me like I was made of armor and stardust. One of them brought me a sandwich after the birth and told me her aunt had lost her home to a Dunn development scam 5 years earlier. Another held my hand during the last stage of labor and whispered, "You're changing everything." When Nora was placed on my chest, she didn't cry right away. She just blinked at me with wide, dark eyes like she already knew who I was. I whispered, "We made it, baby girl," and she finally let out a sound, soft, high-pitched, alive. In that moment, every insult, every betrayal, every moment of silence I had swallowed for the sake of survival felt worth it. The following week, our story broke wide open. Front page of the Riverbend Times, 3 columns across, black and white photo of me leaving the courthouse with Nora wrapped in a pale blanket and Layla at my side. The headline read, "Whistleblower Mother Exposes Riverbend Dynasty, Justice or Revenge?" People argued about that for weeks, especially the ones who used to line up for Dunn galas or sat on city boards funded by their donations. But the tide had already turned, and once the evidence started surfacing, real documents, recordings, financial trails, the same people who had once snubbed me were suddenly asking for meetings. Mara's legal team filed the formal lawsuit for asset division and full custody within 72 hours of the farewell party. The judge, an older woman with no patience for theatrics, granted us an emergency injunction preventing the Dunns from selling, hiding, or transferring any of their properties until the investigation concluded. That move alone saved half a dozen development victims from being forcibly evicted. Margot tried to play the sympathy card by leaking a statement to the local paper about deeply personal family matters. It backfired. Within days, another woman came forward, one who had worked for the Dunn estate for 15 years before being fired for getting pregnant without being married. Then another, and another. Within a month, the case had grown so large that the state sent 2 investigators to Riverbend. The charges included everything from fraudulent loan applications to unlawful zoning reclassifications and forged environmental approvals. It wasn't just dirty business. It was industrial-scale corruption dressed up in designer suits and presented as growth. While the case developed, I focused on building something real. Layla and I used my share of the settlement money to launch a nonprofit called New Roots Development. Our mission was simple: affordable, honest housing for women and families who had been left behind by systems built to serve men like Charles Dunn. We found an abandoned warehouse near the river, renovated it with help from local contractors who volunteered their time, and turned it into a co-working and support space. The lower floor became a free child care center, the upper level a legal clinic and transitional housing office. We even turned part of the old Dunn estate into a resource center for single mothers. The best part? Every single inch of it was funded by the exact assets Margot and Charles had once tried to keep from me. Nora turned 6 months old the day I stood in front of that building and gave my first public speech. The sun was setting behind the hill, casting warm gold light across the crowd gathered on the front lawn. Friends, local reporters, city officials, and women who had emailed me weeks earlier asking for help. I looked out at them, holding Nora in one arm and my notes in the other, and I didn't speak about vengeance. I spoke about rebuilding. This is not about destroying a legacy, I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. This is about replacing a broken system with something better. It's about choosing integrity over intimidation. And it's about making sure our daughters grow up in a town that sees them as more than tools or trophies. People clapped, but that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that for the first time, Riverbend wasn't looking at me as someone who had been discarded. They were looking at me as someone who had built something new from the ruins. The trial began 6 weeks later, and from the first day, the courtroom was packed. On one side, the Dunn family's legal team, sharp-suited and desperately trying to untangle decades of quiet fraud. On the other, Mara, calm and surgical, backed by piles of evidence, sworn testimonies, and enough witnesses to fill the first 3 rows. Grant was there, too, though he looked nothing like the man who had stood beside Melissa at that cursed farewell party. His hair was thinner, his suit wrinkled, his face drawn. Melissa had vanished within a month of the live stream going viral. No apology, no explanation, just gone. Grant never brought her up again. Not even once. Charles pled not guilty and tried to bluff his way through the hearings. It didn't work. After 3 days of cross-examination, his voice cracked and he stopped answering questions altogether. Margot refused to testify, citing medical distress. The judge wasn't impressed. On the 3rd week of trial, I took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as I walked to the front, placed my hand on the Bible, and sat down with Nora watching from the gallery in Layla's arms. Mara asked the questions gently, like we'd rehearsed 100 times. Claire, can you describe your experience within the Dunn household during your marriage? I didn't flinch. I didn't soften anything. I told them everything. The threats, the manipulation, the financial control, the medical gaslighting, the psychological warfare, the betrayal, the cold, calculated removal masked as tradition. I watched jurors react, some shifting uncomfortably, others nodding slowly as the truth settled into their bones. By the time I finished, the courtroom didn't just sympathize with me. They believed me. And for once, that was enough. By the time the trial entered its final phase, I had stopped checking the court calendar every morning because I no longer needed reminders to brace myself. The courtroom had become a second home. Its cold benches, its low hum of tension, the way reporters scribbled notes every time I cleared my throat or adjusted my blazer. I didn't flinch anymore. I didn't feel small under their eyes. If anything, I had started to feel something dangerously close to peace. Nora had learned to crawl in the middle of all of it. Layla recorded a video of her dragging herself across my apartment's living room floor, chubby fists clenched, her face determined like she had somewhere to be. That moment wrecked me in the best way. After everything, After the betrayal, the public shame, the fear, I had created something pure. Nora didn't care about last names or headlines. She just wanted to chase the beam of sunlight crawling across the floor. On the second to last day of the trial, Grant took the stand. He didn't walk with the same swagger he used to carry in every room, and the suit he wore looked like it had been pulled from the back of someone else's closet. For the first time, I saw the weight of his choices etched into every corner of his face, and maybe a piece of me even felt sorry for him. But only for a moment. When the prosecutor asked, "Did you willingly participate in the deception and public humiliation of your wife?" Grant didn't try to deflect. He didn't argue. He didn't cry. He just nodded once, then looked at me across the courtroom. "It was my father's idea," he said, voice thin and dry like he hadn't spoken in weeks. But I didn't stop it. I let it happen. I thought it was what I was supposed to do. The room fell so quiet you could hear the security guard shift his weight in the back corner. "And did you ever love her?" the prosecutor asked, almost gently. Grant paused, looked down at his hands, and whispered something that sounded like "at the beginning." But I didn't need to hear him say it to know the truth. If he had loved me, even a fraction of what he claimed in front of our friends and family during our wedding, he wouldn't have sat silent as they tried to erase me. When it was my turn to respond, I didn't attack him. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply said, "He may have loved me once, but it was never more than he loved his comfort." And that was it. That was the end of the story between us. The next morning, the courtroom was filled to capacity. People from all corners of Riverbend had packed the gallery, some out of support, others because they still clung to what the Dunns had once represented. Reporters stood at the back wall, cameras ready. Nora stayed home that day with Layla's mom, who had become something of a grandmother figure to her over the past few months. I needed to walk into that room carrying nothing but my own voice. The judge entered, gavel tapping twice, her expression as unreadable as always. But when she spoke, her tone held the kind of finality that could change lives. "In the matter of Claire versus the Dunn family, the court has reached a decision." I didn't breathe. Not once. In the divorce suit, the court awards Claire full and permanent custody of the child, Nora, and recognizes her as the sole legal guardian. A ripple moved through the room. Someone in the back quietly exhaled, and I realized it wasn't just my breath I'd been holding. In regard to property and asset division, the court grants Claire 40% of the Dunn real estate holdings, including access to property formerly held in trust. Margot let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, and Grant lowered his eyes to the floor. Furthermore, the judge continued, due to substantial and corroborated evidence of illegal activity, a formal investigation into Dunn Properties business practices will proceed under state supervision. Criminal charges are under review. And just like that, the story ended. Not with vengeance. Not with some dramatic outburst or shouting match or final blow. Just truth, spoken aloud for everyone to hear. As I stood to leave, I felt someone watching me. Grant sat alone near the edge of the defense table, shoulders hunched, fingers loosely tangled in the hem of his jacket. He looked up, and for a moment, our eyes met. He whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "Can you ever forgive me?" I didn't stop walking, but I paused just long enough to turn my head. "Forgiveness is possible," I said, "but forgetting isn't, and going back will never happen." Then I walked into the sunlight and didn't look back. Outside, the crowd that had gathered began clapping. Not wildly, not like they were watching a celebrity walk out of a movie premiere, but slowly, deliberately, like they knew what this meant. A woman beside the courthouse steps handed me a bouquet of wildflowers. An elderly man nodded in my direction with quiet pride. That afternoon, I sat with Nora in my lap, watching the sunset from the same riverbank where Grant had once proposed to me. The bench felt warmer now, like it belonged to me in a way it never had before. Nora reached for a dandelion growing through a crack in the sidewalk, and I told her, "You were never born into the Dunn legacy. You were born into freedom." She babbled something back in baby gibberish and stuffed a fistful of grass into her mouth. I laughed until tears rolled down my cheeks, not because I was sad, not because I was scared, but because the laughter came from someplace clean and untouched by all the rot I had climbed through. A month later, Mara and I finalized the framework for something bigger. We were going to take everything we had learned, everything we had seen, and build the kind of organization that couldn't be destroyed by inheritance or nameplates or country club favors. We expanded New Roots development into a state-level initiative. We began drafting legislation to protect single mothers from being coerced out of custody or housing through financial manipulation. We secured funding from cities that had quietly watched the Dunn downfall and decided they didn't want to be next. Every week, I met more women like me. Not all of them had walked away from multi-million-dollar legacies, but they had walked through fire in other ways: abuse, poverty, isolation, silence. Some were scared. Some were furious. Some didn't even have the words yet for what had happened to them. But they all had one thing in common. They didn't want to be victims. They wanted to rebuild. Nora turned 1 just as the state filed its final charges against Charles and Margot. Charles was sentenced to 3 years for fraud and obstruction, with more charges pending. He served 1 year before being transferred to house arrest due to his failing health. Margot vanished from public life entirely, and last I heard, she was living in a rented apartment in another county, far away from the people who used to call her Queen of Riverbend. Grant opened a furniture repair shop in a neighboring town. He wrote me letters, too many letters. I never responded. Eventually, they stopped. And me? I was rebuilding a legacy, not one made of money, but one built from resilience. 5 years after everything ended, I stood barefoot in the garden behind our new home, watching Nora chase butterflies between the lavender bushes. The land used to be part of a Dunn estate lot, one they tried to seize for a golf course expansion before the courts blocked the permit and handed it back to the city. I bought it through New Roots, built a small house with high windows and sunlit rooms, and planted every flower bed with my own hands. Nothing here was inherited. Every inch was earned. Nora was 5 now, stubborn and bright, with wild curls and a habit of asking impossible questions right before bedtime. She had her own ideas about the world, strong opinions about fairness, snack distribution, and whether or not clouds could smell like anything. She once told me she wanted to be a person who makes things safer. I told her she already was. That morning, she had proudly gathered a bundle of flowers from the yard and presented them like a royal offering. "For your office," she said, eyes sparkling, "so you don't forget who loves you most." I placed them in a glass jar on my desk and promised her I'd never forget, not even for a second. New Roots development had grown into something none of us imagined in those early days. We had support centers in 5 counties, state funding, and a wait list of cities asking to replicate our model. Our offices were housed in what used to be the Dunn Mansion. Half of it turned into community housing, the other half into a legal and wellness hub. Every time I walked through the front doors, I felt like the building was finally being used for something good. The rooms no longer echoed with quiet judgment. They hummed with purpose. People in Riverbend had changed, too. The silence that once followed me through grocery store aisles had disappeared. The stares had softened, the whispers replaced with quiet nods, and, sometimes, a thank you. It didn't happen overnight. Some people clung to their version of the Dunn legacy like it was a family heirloom, too fragile to question. But truth has a way of enduring longer than gossip. Earlier this week, I received word that our proposed state bill supporting housing access for single mothers had passed unanimously. Judith, now our senior policy advisor, delivered the news with tears in her eyes. "You've reshaped the system that once tried to crush you," she told me. I smiled and said, "No, we did." That afternoon, we held a small ceremony in the community garden, a space built on what used to be the Riverbend Country Club's private lawn. We filled it with local families, food vendors, volunteers, and music from a school jazz trio. Toward the end, as I was stepping down from the podium, I saw him standing near the back. Grant. Older, thinner, quieter. He gave a small bow, not quite a wave. I nodded once in return. Nora tugged on my hand and asked, "Mommy, are you happy?" I looked down at her freckled face, her muddy shoes, and the soft flowers still clutched in her other hand. "Yes," I told her, my voice firm and clear. I'm happier than I've ever been. And we walked home together, hand in hand, into the future we built with nothing but truth and grit.